करके वे सुन के देते हैं। दो पुंज चपकर बच्चे से को पुरके छे सकते हैं तो उम्र सत्यों को पुंचर सक जाके मात पा।
They chained him like an animal and sold him in front of the whole town. But what they didn't know was that the man they called a savage would soon risk his life to save one of their own, and in doing so, expose every lie they ever believed about him. This isn't just a story of the Wild West. It's a story about who we choose to be when no one else believes we can change. No one remembered who first started calling it justice in Durango. Maybe it was the preacher, maybe it was the sheriff. But what unfolded in the courthouse square that day had nothing to do with law or mercy. It was something darker, hungrier, the kind of thing that left a stain on the soul of a town, no matter how many years went by. The air was thick with dust and anticipation. It clung to skin like guilt, settled into the folds of dresses and the cracks of boot leather. High above, the sun beat down like a judge without patience. Below, in the packed dirt between the sheriff's office and the town saloon, a crowd had gathered, not for prayer or protest, but for a sale. A man was to be auctioned. He stood shackled at the center of the crowd, iron biting into wrists and ankles, his shoulders bare beneath the sun, streaked with sweat and blood. He said nothing. He looked at no one. And yet every eye was on him, because even in chains, Elias Redfern did not look like a man defeated. He looked like a monument, like something carved from the earth itself. People whispered stories about him. Some said he was a horse thief from the Animas trails. Others swore he'd killed 5 men in a mining camp brawl. But all agreed on one thing. He was dangerous. Not because of what he had done, but because of what he represented. He was a native, a savage. And in the eyes of many in that crowd, that alone was enough. Sheriff Clay Morgan took the wooden steps of the makeshift platform and raised one hand. His voice rang out across the square, practiced and hollow. Durango citizens, we're here today under order of the circuit judge. This man, he gestured toward Elias, has been found guilty of livestock theft from the Dunley Ranch. As such, he is to be sold to cover damages owed. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Children clung to mothers' skirts. Men folded arms across their chests. One woman crossed herself. Strong back, the sheriff continued. Used to hard labor. $50 starting bid. There was a pause. Then a voice, low, amused, called out, "What's he come with? Rope or muzzle?" Laughter. "He'll work the mines till he breaks," someone added. Elias didn't flinch. He simply raised his head and looked out. Past the jeers, the dust, the judgment. His eyes swept the crowd, not with hate or fear, but with something colder, pity. And then a sound no one expected cut through the tension like a blade. "I'll buy him." The voice came from the edge of the crowd, soft, feminine, but with the force of a thunderclap. All heads turned. There, standing in a plain brown dress stained with road dust, was Abigail Crowley, the widow Crowley. Her auburn hair was pulled back, severe as her reputation. She lived alone on a rundown ranch 5 miles south of town. Too proud to sell, too stubborn to fail, and now, apparently, crazy enough to claim a man in chains. Sheriff Morgan blinked. "Pardon?" Abigail stepped forward. Her boots crunched in the silence. $70, she said, holding up a leather pouch. "All I have. I'll take him." The silence that followed was deep and electric. Even the horses tethered nearby seemed to hold their breath. "Abigail," gasped Mrs. Tilley, the banker's wife, "what in heaven's name are you doing?" "You can't bring that savage onto your land," another voice snarled. "He'll kill you in your sleep." "He's not property," Abigail said. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. "But if the law insists on selling him like he is, Then I'll be the one to own the burden of that shame. Sheriff Morgan's jaw tensed. The judge ordered a sale, not a sermon. Then sell him to me, she replied, or tell this town its law changes depending on who holds the coin. It was a challenge, a direct shot to every man in the square who thought the badge gave them control. Morgan hesitated, then snatched the pouch from her hand. He counted the coins with slow, exaggerated movement. When the total came up correct, he grunted. "Fine, bill of sales in my office. I'll take him now." "That's not how I paid," Abigail said, stepping onto the platform. "Unless you want me to tell the judge you denied me after accepting lawful tender." Morgan bristled, then gestured to the deputy. Keys jangled, shackles loosened. The chains fell away from Elias Redfern and hit the wood with a sound like a gunshot. The crowd stirred, uneasy. Abigail turned to the man she had just bought. "My wagon's that way," she said, nodding toward the dusty road. "Come if you want. I won't keep you in chains." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. He stepped off the platform. As they walked together through the parted sea of townspeople, the murmurs returned. "She's lost her mind. She's not safe. She'll learn." But Abigail kept her eyes ahead, and Elias Redfern, silent as the mountains behind them, walked by her side. Later, people would argue about what they saw in that moment. Some would say she was deluded. Others would say he bewitched her. But years later, when stories were told, when Durango changed and changed again, they would always begin with that day in the square, with the woman who spoke up when no one else would, with the man who didn't run, even when freed, and with a phrase that hung in the air long after the dust had settled: "I see a man worth saving." The wheels of the wagon groaned as they rolled over the uneven terrain, the distant outline of Durango growing smaller behind them with each passing minute. Abigail Crowley sat upright, reins firm in her hands, but her thoughts spun in silent circles. The man she had just bought rode in the back, unshackled but silent. Every creak of the wagon seemed louder with the unspoken questions hanging between them. What had she just done? The land stretched before them, open, wild, indifferent. Sagebrush dotted the golden plains, and the canyon walls rose in shades of burnt red and ochre, like old bones guarding buried truths. Somewhere overhead, a hawk cried out, wheeling beneath a sky too vast to be owned. Elias Redfern sat with his back against a crate of tools, hands resting on his knees. His eyes, dark and unreadable, scanned the passing landscape. But every so often, Abigail caught him glancing toward her reflection in the wagon's side mirror. It wasn't a stare of hostility. If anything, it was wariness. Measured, observant, patient. Like a man who'd learned long ago not to speak until he knew the room. "You can talk, you know," she finally said without turning. "I didn't buy your silence." He didn't answer. They rode on. By the time the sun began to sink behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the land, they reached the edge of Abigail's ranch. A tired-looking fence ran alongside a plot of parched soil. The house stood up ahead, small and weathered, but standing proud against the wind. To its left, a dilapidated barn leaned like an old man, half its roof gone. Chickens wandered freely, unbothered by the dust or the arrival of strangers. "This is it," Abigail said, stopping the wagon. "Not much, but it's mine." Elias jumped down and began unloading the supplies without a word. She noticed the way he moved, efficient, unhesitating, as though the labor gave him comfort. He stacked the grain sacks by the shed, repaired a loose gate hinge, then approached the trough where the horses drank and fixed a slanted beam without being asked. "You work fast," she said. offering him a tin cup of water. He accepted it, nodding. Idle hands invite weakness. His voice was low and gravelly, shaped by long silences. There was something in it that made her heart thud, not fear, not attraction, but a weight she couldn't name. It was the sound of someone who had lost more than he'd ever been allowed to grieve. "Why didn't you run?" she asked him suddenly. "Back there in town, once the shackles were off. You could have vanished." Elias stared at her. "Run where? Every road is watched, every town has eyes. Out there, I'm still a man with a price on his back. In here." He gestured toward the land. "You gave me a choice. That's more than most." The simplicity of it struck her. A choice. All she'd given was $70 and an open door, but for him it was everything. She showed him to a room off the kitchen. A cot, a blanket, a place to rest his body and not fear the night. "This is yours," she said. "Not a prison, not a servant's quarters, just a room." He nodded again, as if unfamiliar with such things. The next morning, before the sun had even finished rising, she found him outside fixing the chicken coop, muttering softly in a language she didn't recognize as he worked. There was rhythm in his hands, almost reverence, as though each repair was a form of atonement or prayer. Abigail brought him coffee. "You don't sleep much, do you?" Elias took the cup, held it with both hands like it was something sacred. "Sleep comes when it's earned." She smiled faintly. "Well, I suppose you've earned a week of it already." He didn't smile back, but something flickered in his eyes. Not amusement, something gentler. Familiarity, maybe, or the ghost of it. Later that week, as they walked the southern fence line inspecting damage from a spring storm, Abigail paused by a patch of wild herbs she hadn't seen bloom in years. Elias knelt beside it. "This one here," he said, pointing. "Good for infection. Crush the leaves, add to water. It draws out the fever." She blinked. "You know plants." "My mother was a healer," he said simply, "before the soldiers burned our village. She taught me everything she knew." For the first time, she saw not just a man cast aside by society, but a man shaped by generations. His voice didn't tremble with the memory. It carried it, like something precious. "Maybe you can help me rebuild the garden shed," she offered. "It's falling apart, but I used to grow herbs too." He nodded, and they spent the afternoon clearing weeds and laying new planks. She told him about her late husband, Isaac, how he'd died during the fever winter and left behind dreams buried beneath debt. She talked not because she expected a response, but because something about Elias made silence feel less threatening. That evening, over stew and firelight, she asked him, "Do you believe in second chances?" He looked into the flame for a long moment. "I believe they're rare and never free." "But do you think they're real?" He turned toward her. "Only when someone decides to see you different than the world does." Something in her chest twisted, because that was exactly what she'd done. And now, sitting across from him, this man who barely spoke, who worked without asking, who wore his pain like armor, she realized she was no longer sure who was rescuing whom. They didn't speak the rest of the night. But when she passed him the last biscuit, and he split it in two without thinking, Abigail felt it. The beginning of something neither of them had expected. Not just trust, but hope. The wind howled that night across the high ridge, carrying with it a cold that felt less like weather and more like a warning. Abigail Crowley stood at her front door, arms crossed, the porch lantern flickering against the dark. Somewhere beyond the hills, trouble was stirring, and she could feel it in her bones like the ache of an old wound. Elias Redfern had sensed it too. He had been quiet all day, not his usual quiet, but watchful, like a man waiting for something inevitable. He spent hours reinforcing the barn doors and walking the fence lines, his eyes scanning the distant landscape as if it were speaking to him in some secret tongue. "What is it you see out there?" Abigail had asked him at sunset. He hadn't answered. But now, as the first stars blinked to life and the cold sank deeper into the soil, she understood. It wasn't what he saw. It was what he remembered. Men like Elias didn't just anticipate danger. They remembered the exact shape of it. The news came not from a telegram or a letter, but in the frantic gallop of hooves and the breathless words of a boy barely old enough to hold a rifle. "It's the Palmer's place," he gasped from atop his horse. "Fire broke out. Barns lit up like the sun. They think Maggie's still inside." Elias didn't wait for more. He was off the porch before Abigail could speak, his feet pounding the dirt road as he ran straight toward the ridge. Abigail followed on horseback, lantern in hand, her pulse thudding against her ribs. By the time they reached the Palmer homestead, the flames had turned the barn into a living furnace. Neighbors formed a ragged line from the well, tossing buckets of water against the inferno with desperate futility. The fire roared louder than any scream, until it was drowned out by the voice of a woman. "My baby's in there," Mrs. Palmer sobbed, clawing at the arms that held her back. Maggie, 7 years old, trapped inside a building that was seconds from collapse. "No one can go in there," someone shouted. "It's suicide." But Elias was already moving. He tore a wet burlap sack from a pile near the well, wrapped it around his arms, and vanished into the fire without a word. Time folded in on itself. Abigail stood frozen, the lantern shaking in her grip, every breath caught in her throat. The flames danced higher, casting monstrous shadows across the snow-dusted ground. Smoke thickened. Someone whispered a prayer, and then, just as the roof groaned with the threat of collapse, he emerged. Elias carried the child in his arms, her face pressed to his chest, her body limp but breathing. The crowd erupted in cries and gasps. Mrs. Palmer collapsed to her knees, weeping. Elias staggered, coughing, his clothes scorched, his hair singed, but his eyes were clear. He handed Maggie to her mother and stepped away. No words, no gesture of triumph. Just a man who had done what had to be done. Abigail rushed to his side, guiding him toward the well, where she doused his burns with cool water, her hands trembling. "You're insane," she whispered. "You should be dead." "I've walked through worse," he rasped. "But I wasn't carrying anyone worth saving back then." It was the most he had ever said in one breath. She looked at him, her throat thick. This man, who had been sold like cattle, who had lived with chains on his wrists, had just saved the life of a child who, weeks ago, might have called him a monster. Word of what happened spread through Durango like a summer lightning storm. By morning, everyone knew. Some were shocked into silence. Others found themselves unable to speak at all when they passed Elias in town. A few brave souls nodded at him, muttered a thank you, offered a handshake he didn't take. But the shift had begun. Paul Palmer brought eggs the next day. Tom Carson showed up with a hammer and nails and helped reinforce the Crowley barn door. The preacher's wife stopped by with bread and left without a word, but Abigail caught the tears she wiped away. Of course, not all hearts softened. There were those who clung to suspicion like a badge of honor. One evening, Abigail found a knife buried in the side of her fence post with a note carved into the handle. "You saved one. Don't forget what he is." She burned the note and said nothing. But Elias saw the smoke. "I know who they think I am," he said quietly, "but I won't leave, not yet." "You're not going anywhere," Abigail replied. "We haven't finished the garden." It was easier now between them. They talked more about the weather, about the ranch, about her late husband Isaac, who once dreamed of turning the high meadow into an orchard, about Elias's sister, who died during a winter raid when the soldiers came. They never spoke of the fire again, until one morning, as they repaired the eastern fence, Elias paused, hammer mid-air. "You didn't ask me why I went in." "I didn't need to," Abigail said. "I saw my sister in that girl," he whispered, "and I saw myself standing there, frozen, doing nothing." He looked at her then, not with pain but with clarity. "I won't be that man again." Abigail didn't answer. She just reached for the other end of the plank and held it steady while he nailed it in. That evening, as the first snow of winter fell on Durango, she hung a horseshoe above the barn door, not for luck, but for memory. A reminder that some homes are built not by blood or land, but by fire, by what we choose to protect, and who we choose to stand beside when the night gets too cold to face alone. Winter settled over Durango like a secret the land refused to tell. The mountains wore their snowcaps like crowns, and the wind sang low through the valleys, ancient and restless. But on Abigail Crowley's ranch, something else had begun to stir beneath the frost. Something softer than snow, stronger than fear. The fire had changed everything, and not just for Elias Redfern. The townspeople had watched him run into that burning barn with nothing but a wet sack and a heartbeat. And though they didn't say it out loud, something inside them shifted that day. A man doesn't risk his life for a child and stay a savage in your mind for long, not if your conscience is awake. In the weeks that followed, small gestures replaced silence. A bag of nails left on Abigail's porch, a wheel of cheese from the McKinleys, a note of thanks scribbled in a child's handwriting and tucked into the garden gate. Durango wasn't a town that apologized with words. It did so with offerings. Still, there were two Durangos, one that began to see Elias as a man, and another that clung tightly to the old ways, the old fears. It didn't matter. Abigail had stopped waiting for permission. She and Elias spent their days working side by side, preparing the ranch for winter's full grip. Together they rebuilt the medicine shed that had long fallen into disrepair, replacing rotted wood, washing glass jars, organizing dried herbs by the fireplace where Abigail's late husband once sat. Elias identified each plant like an old friend. Yarrow, sage, elderberry, willow bark. Remedies passed down from his mother, her mother before her. "You should teach," Abigail said one afternoon, brushing dust from a shelf. "People don't know these things anymore, especially not the children." "I'm no teacher," he replied without looking up. "You are," she said without doubt. "You just don't know it yet." A week later, she invited 3 children from town to the ranch. At first, they came for the cookies Abigail baked. Then they stayed because Elias showed them how to speak with their hands when words didn't work, how to listen to birds to tell time, how to know if a storm was coming by the scent in the wind. They were wide-eyed and silent, the way children get when they're standing in front of something real. And Elias, though awkward, though quiet, never spoke down to them. He showed them how to use a knife, how to harvest without wounding a root. They watched him the way people watch someone who belongs to the earth more than to men. One afternoon, as they left with pockets full of mint leaves and pine resin, the youngest turned back and asked Abigail, "Is he a hero?" She smiled. "He's more than that. He's still becoming." Word got out. More parents sent their children. Some came themselves, curious, skeptical, unsure of what they might find. And what they found was a man who healed more than he hurt, who offered knowledge instead of fear. But the town was still split. A man like Randall Huxley wasn't about to surrender his power to a growing sense of empathy. He started small. Quiet rumors in the saloon. Mutters about Abigail's ranch turning into a school for half-breeds. He paid a drifter to scrawl slurs on the side of her barn. When that didn't shake her, he tried louder tactics, standing at town meetings, asking why a known outlaw was being allowed to teach children. But each time, fewer people nodded. Because for every lie he spread, Elias countered it with truth. He built, he taught, he protected. There was a moment, small but seismic, that shifted everything for Abigail. One crisp morning, as frost clung to the windows and smoke curled from the chimney, she found Elias carving a figure from a block of juniper. It was a bird, delicate, wings outstretched. "For you," he said, handing it to her. "It's a red-tailed hawk. My mother used to say they bring clarity." She held it like a precious thing. "Why me?" "Because you saw me when others saw chains." Abigail felt her throat tighten. She had spent years building fences, walls, rooms no one entered. And somehow this man, whose silence once unnerved her, had opened a door inside her that had long been locked. They didn't speak of love. Not yet. What they shared wasn't loud or labeled. It lived in the spaces between shared meals, in the way Elias always fixed her saddle before she could ask, in the way she kept his favorite blanket folded by the fire. It was, in many ways, the purest thing either of them had ever known. But peace is never permanent in places built on old scars. Late one evening, they returned from checking the northern pasture to find the chicken coop door splintered open, feathers scattered, and a crude sign painted in blood red on the side of the fence. "Go back." Elias stared at it for a long time. Abigail reached for his hand, but he stepped away, knelt beside the broken coop, and began gathering the limp bodies of the hens. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He shook his head. "This isn't new, only louder." She felt the familiar fury rise in her chest, the same rage that had driven her to raise her hand in that town square. But this time, it wasn't just about justice. It was about him. "We rebuild," he said, rising to his feet. "That's what we do." And they did. They fixed the coop, painted over the sign, planted late-season garlic and mulched the herb beds for winter. They didn't wait for the town to save them. They saved each other. Because by then, they knew. It was no longer about survival. It was about belonging. The storm came without warning. Not the kind that rides on thunder or cracks the sky with lightning. This one came on horseback, cloaked in cold intent and bitter silence. 6 men. Torches lit like declarations. Eyes full of old hate and new excuses. They rode hard, dust curling behind them like ghosts of an uglier time. Abigail Crowley saw them first, standing at her kitchen window just before dusk. She recognized the lead rider instantly. Randall Huxley, his hat pulled low, his smile smug. He'd made threats before, whispered poison into town meetings and behind closed saloon doors. But this was something different. This was him delivering his verdict. Elias was already outside, splitting logs by the barn. He didn't flinch when he saw the riders. He simply set the axe down, stood tall, and waited. Abigail met him halfway to the fence line. "They're not here to talk," she said. "I know," he replied. "You should leave. Now, head for the canyon, take the ridge road." "I'm not running," Elias said, his voice calm. "Not from them, not from this." Her throat tightened. "Then we stand." They did. On the front porch of the old house that had seen fire, wind, and grief, they stood side by side as the horses slowed to a halt. Huxley didn't dismount. He looked down at them like a man surveying his prize. "Evening, Crowley," he called. "You got something that doesn't belong." Abigail's grip on the rifle tightened. "You don't get to decide who belongs." Huxley smirked. "You think because he saved a child, because he planted a few roots, he's one of us. He's not. He never will be. Men like him, men born to the dirt, can't wash off what they are." Elias stepped forward. "I didn't come here to change your mind," he said. "I came here to build something, and I did." Huxley laughed bitterly. "You built nothing but a lie." From behind the barn came the flicker of movement. More lanterns, more footsteps. One by one they appeared. Paul Palmer, the preacher's wife, Tom Carson and his brother, Mrs. Tilley with a shovel in her hand and fury in her eyes, even little Maggie clutching her mother's skirt. "You're wrong, Huxley," Paul said, stepping forward. "He didn't build a lie, he helped build us." Huxley shifted in his saddle. The math had changed. "You're siding with a murderer?" "No court ever proved that," Tom snapped. "But we saw him run into fire. We saw him teach our children. That counts more than the stories you spread." Huxley's fingers twitched near his holster. Elias didn't move. Abigail's voice cut through the air. "Call him savage all you want, Randall. I see a man who saved more lives than you've ever touched. I see a man who walks with honor. And I see a man worth saving." The torch Huxley held dropped, hissing in the snow. He stared at them, at her, like she'd taken something from him, and maybe she had. Pride, power, the narrative he clung to. He turned his horse without a word, and the rest followed. As the hooves faded into the night, the crowd remained. No one spoke right away. Then someone, Mrs. Tilley maybe, started to clap. Not loud, not triumphant, just real. It spread, slow and steady, like sunrise. Abigail turned to Elias. He looked at her, not with victory, but with something far more difficult to carry. Acceptance, gratitude, vulnerability. "You stood with me," he said. "I always will," she answered. Weeks passed. Snow melted. Crocuses bloomed beside the steps. Children returned to the ranch, now called the Ridge School, where Elias taught them the language of the land and the roots of healing. Abigail read to them from old books. Together they created something no one could take, a place of memory and renewal. The town changed too, not overnight and not entirely, but it bent, like a tree learning to grow toward the light. One morning, as Elias finished stacking firewood, Abigail called him inside. She held something in her hand, a simple arrowhead strung on leather. "I found this near the southern fence," she said. "Thought you should have it." He took it, rubbed his thumb along its edge, and looked around the room. The shelves lined with dried herbs, the fire burning low, the quilt she'd sewn last spring. "No," he said softly. "You should keep it. It belongs here now." She tied it above the door, a symbol of what had been lost, of what had been claimed, of what had been redeemed. That night, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars bloom. There were no grand declarations, no vows, just two people breathing in a land that had tried to bury them both. And in the stillness, Abigail reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. In that touch lived everything they'd built. Not just a home, but a truth neither chains nor fire could erase. Elias Redfern had once stood in chains, silent and condemned. But now, here, beneath the wide western sky, he belonged. Not because the town said so, but because he had earned it, and because someone had seen him, truly seen him, when no one else dared to look. A man worth saving. A life worth living. A future worth building. Together. The story of Elias Redfern is not merely a tale of fire and redemption, nor is it just another echo from the Wild West. It is, at its heart, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the transformational power of compassion, and the silent strength of those the world tries to forget. We first met Elias as a figure of quiet defiance, chained, humiliated, and sold beneath the burning sun of Durango. He said nothing as the town condemned him. He didn't beg, he didn't fight, he simply stood, stone still, dignified, and dangerous to a world that feared what it could not understand. They called him a savage. They saw only his silence, his skin, his ancestry, and made their judgments. But then, Abigail Crowley stepped forward. She wasn't a hero, not in the traditional sense. She was a widow, a woman hardened by grief and worn down by the weight of a world that made it hard for women to speak and even harder to be heard. But something in her refused to look away. Where others saw an outlaw, she saw a man. Where others saw a threat, she saw potential. And when no one else raised a hand for Elias, she raised her voice and changed both their lives forever. Their story was never about romance or rescue. It was about recognition. Elias didn't become a better man because Abigail saved him. He was already that man. What changed was that someone finally chose to see him as human, and in return, Elias showed not just loyalty, but depth. He worked not to earn favor, but because working the land meant survival, and survival meant keeping something alive that once felt impossible. Hope. The turning point came, as it often does, not through conversation, but crisis. When the Palmer's barn went up in flames, and a little girl was left inside, Elias didn't hesitate. He ran into the fire, literally, because he'd once failed to save someone he loved. This time, he would not stand still. That moment didn't make him a hero. It simply revealed the one he had always been. From that point on, the town began to change, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. People who once spat in the dirt at the sound of his name began nodding to him in the street. Children sat cross-legged at his feet, learning how to track deer, how to treat wounds with roots, how to survive with integrity. Elias became something Durango had never known it needed, a bridge between past and future, between fear and understanding. But change is never welcomed by all. Randall Huxley, representing the old order, the old fears, rose in fury. To him, Elias was proof that the world was slipping away from men like him. And so he came, riding hard with torches and threats, hoping to erase everything Elias and Abigail had built. What he found was a town no longer willing to be ruled by hate. Neighbors stepped out of the shadows. Farmers, widows, preachers, children, all standing in quiet defiance, not with guns, but with presence, with memory, with gratitude. It wasn't Elias's strength that saved the ranch that night. It was his legacy, the lessons he had taught, the fires he had braved, the trust he had earned, not demanded, spoke louder than Huxley's hate ever could. And when the dust settled and the torches dimmed, Elias Redfern was no longer the outsider. He was part of Durango's story, its future, its soul. And Abigail? She was never just a woman who offered him freedom. She was the first to see the truth. And in doing so, she changed everything. Not just for Elias, but for a town learning, slowly, how to heal. What can we learn from Elias's journey? In a world that still judges too quickly, labels too easily, and fears what it doesn't understand, this story feels more relevant than ever. Elias teaches us that quiet strength can be more powerful than loud declarations. That action, not appearance, defines a person. That redemption isn't something handed to you, it's something you build, brick by brick, deed by deed. From Abigail, we learn that courage often looks like kindness in public. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak when the room wants you silent. And that love, real, grounding, transformative love, is often built not on passion but on partnership, on shared soil, on walking through storms side by side. Together, their story reminds us that change doesn't happen all at once. It starts with a decision, a choice to see differently, to believe in someone when it's easier to doubt, to listen when you've been taught to turn away. So ask yourself, who in your life have you judged too quickly? Who have you overlooked because they didn't fit the story you were told? What strength, what brilliance, what loyalty might you have missed? And more importantly, what kind of world are you helping to build with the way you choose to see people? This story isn't just about the Wild West. It's about right now. It's about every person who ever stood alone while others whispered. Every person who's had to prove their humanity again and again. And every soul still waiting for someone to stand beside them and say, I see you. I believe in you. You matter. Let that be the lesson we carry forward. And if this story moved you, if Elias's quiet courage or Abigail's unshakable spirit stirred something in you, then help us keep stories like this alive. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment with what resonated with you most, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because there are still stories out there waiting to be told. And maybe, just maybe, you're the one who needs to hear the next one. See you in the next journey. Out on the frontier, where the wind still remembers the ones who dared to stand.